I'm co-director of Virtual Roots. Virtual Roots is a UK-based NGO that works in cybersecurity and internet governance research, education, and public engagement. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. We have Yasmin Azuzi to my right in person. We have Louise Marie Harel online, and we have Corinne Kasher, who unfortunately is in a taxi coming from a very similarly named conference center that she was accidentally taken to and will arrive soon. These things happen. So I'll just say a little bit about the purpose of the panel overall, and then I'll hand over to our speakers. I will start with Louise online, then I'll go to Yasmin. I'll talk a little bit about my perspective on the paradox of inclusion, and hopefully by then Corinne will have sorted out her travel issues. We'll then open the floor to questions and discussion for everyone, both in person and online. We're very much looking forward to the discussion, and thank you all for being here early on a Thursday morning. So we put together this panel because we felt that there was a real issue with internet governance and inclusion. And we call this a paradox of inclusion. The idea here is that we see a proliferation of efforts to bring in different actors in internet governance, whether these are multi-stakeholder forums, whether these are efforts to include developing countries and smaller states or states with fewer resources. And there's lots of different efforts to do these through different conferences, initiatives, meetings, and so on. In fact, there's so many of these different efforts that actually keeping up with them all, keeping track of them all, and participating meaningfully in them all is itself a high resource burden. And that's what we term the paradox of inclusion. Internet governance recognizes that it has to be inclusive. It has to bring in multiple stakeholders. But those who are really able to track the real range of internet governance forums, from this one to those at the UN, such as the OEWG on cybersecurity, through to the Global Digital Compact, through to the Cybercrime Convention, through to the multi-stakeholder initiatives such as Paris, the Paris Call, etc., right? So this is what we want to talk about today, is the starting point recognizing that inclusion matters, that there are genuine and very well-developed efforts to make internet governance inclusive, but that sometimes these efforts, as we would say in English, for want of a better phrase, shoot themselves in the foot, right? They actually bring up barriers to participation through requiring such a thin spread of attention and resources across the internet governance portfolio. That's the idea behind the session. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this paradox of inclusion, but before we do so, I'll turn to some short opening remarks from each of our speakers. Our first speaker is Louise Marie Harel, who is an Associate Fellow with Virtual Roots and is also working at the Royal United Services Institute. Louise, I'll leave you to do a much better introduction of your own work than I can, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you all. I would love to be there with all of you, but sadly and thankfully also, because since we're talking about inclusion, I think the fact of just being able to connect the IGF has always been great in that sense. And I think James already kind of set a very interesting tone to our conversation here. I am Louise Marie Rell. As James said, I work in the cyber program at RUSI. And we've been reflecting a lot on different elements related to that. But personally, I've been attending the IGF for 10 years now, which is kind of like baffling. And I think there's no other better place to actually have this conversation, because being involved in the IGF throughout different cycles of maturity, and also other spaces such as ICANN, but also being increasingly involved in like the cybersecurity discussions, which is the bit that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. I think you see those different communities of practice emerging. and specializing. So when we look at, in particular, at the proliferation of initiatives, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, and that has something like if you look from 2017 or 2015, right, to today, it's quite impressive to see how many initiatives, especially on cybersecurity, that have emerged. Back then, you would have the group of governmental experts at the UN as the one place, and it was a very kind of multilateral, I mean, it's still a multilateral process, but you would have 30 governments or so discussing what is state responsibility and how international law applies to cyberspace. And back then, also, you would have the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which back then was also like just called the London process, starting to mature and to become a bigger platform. And today, these initiatives have consolidated quite a bit. I mean, obviously, the negotiations at the UN have been taking place for at least 20 years when it comes to state responsibility, but the traction that these dialogues have had is quite substantive. So, just to frame this a bit, right now, I think we see two movements. And one is we can look at the proliferation of these initiatives in firstly as the specialization of the debate, right? I remember I used to attend the IGF like in the like again like 10 years ago, and I would look where is the cyber community here, and you would have one or two panels talking about this from, let's say, a more cyber diplomacy initiative, and you would see government representatives, and I remember in Geneva trying to talk about the GGE at the IGF. But nowadays, there's so many other spaces. There's the Counter Ransomware Initiative, which talks about well, as the name says, ransomware, the Pall Mall process, which looks at commercial cyber proliferation, the OEWG, which is looking at state responsibility, and also, I mean, to some degree, the interdependence between state and non-state responsibility in cyberspace. Um, we have the GFCE, which is looking at capacity building, cyber capacity building, and obviously Yasmin will definitely, touch upon like capacity building from the ITU's perspective. We have the Tech Accord, which is an initiative that was spearheaded by Microsoft, but that tries to create this community of practice and thinking within the private sector and different parts of the private sector, and how they see norms for their own, let's say, sector when it comes to cybersecurity. And the Paris Call, as James already mentioned, which is kind of a mix of different stakeholder groups. So one way in which we can see that discussion, as I said, is the proliferation as the specialization of the debate, where we think that, we cannot have this ethereal, broad conversation. We need to get to these smaller bits and spaces. But obviously the other side of the coin is looking at the proliferation of the debate as also being a political strategy, which it is in many ways. So if you think about the ad hoc committee on cybercrime, that is the result of a long friction at the geopolitical level of Russia trying to push forward in some ways the discussion of actually have not just Russia, but in that case, the presentation of the resolution to have a legally binding instrument on cybercrime, and that really just contemplates the vision of many other countries that have not been involved in the Budapest Convention or that don't necessarily agree that they should just subscribe to something, that they should be part of the development of it, which is an increasingly and very valid point from their standpoint. So you have those movements such as the ad hoc committee, which has ended right now, that becomes part of that, let's say, political strategy. Another example of proliferation being a political strategy is precisely to specialize debate, because then you can control a bit more what the scope is and who's involved in this conversation. So on the other hand, if we look at the Counter Ransomware Initiative, it started out as something that was very much State Department led, right? The US spearheading that, but then it has increased throughout, the last couple of years. And that requires, again, kind of how do you create a platform for a particular dialogue, but that you ensure that you're still open and flexible to bring others on board. And I'm sure James will talk more about the Pall Mall process as something that's quite interesting as well in terms of that proliferation as a political strategy. But I'd say, like from an OEWG standpoint, and James, please flag to me when I am if I'm speaking too much. But I just wanted to give a little bit of a glimpse of the OEWG as part of this paradox of inclusion, right? I think it comes as this proposed solution. So back in 2019, when you had the start of like two simultaneous processes, the GGE, the last GGE and the OEWG, you had this this narrative that the OEWG as an open-ended working group, as a UN mechanism for a particular type of dialogue, it would be more inclusive, firstly, because it would include all member states. So it would shift the conversation to the all of the GA members, the General Assembly members. So from a composition standpoint, it seems that, it would probably be more inclusive, and also that it would have some kind of participation from non-state actors. But so the enabler is that we're going from 30 to 193 countries. The challenge there is obviously that enabling effective participation of member states as part of this process is a whole different ballgame, right? We've been working quite a lot at RUSI to facilitate like workshops on responsible cyber behavior and just working with other governments, like let's say small island states, like talking about ransomware and trying to really kind of democratize the access to some bits of the debate or to go deeper into some elements of the OEWG agenda. There are structural elements that are just reproduced as in these spaces, which is normally you have one person, if it is a small UN mission, you have one diplomat, one person that's there covering a myriad of themes, right? So even if you have a process that has gone to the 193 countries, is it actually an effective participation? Because again, many countries won't see that, state responsibility in cyberspace is the first topic on their national priority, and they only have one person in the UN covering these topics. And on top of that, they really don't prioritize because that's also challenging. And if they want to bring someone from the capital, right, to participate, that's the cost of meaningful inclusion as part of that expansion of those that can participate. So you have an enabler from a process standpoint, but that does not address the structural challenges over there. Obviously, there's some solutions, such as the Women in Cyber Fellowship, which is an initiative that is funded by State Department, the UK government, Australia, and a couple of others that seek to bring women diplomats or let's say representatives of national cybersecurity agencies to be the representatives at the OAWG. So again, how do you you enable a process, but then how do you make sure that that process is actually inclusive at the end of the day? So it's more of a walking the talk paradox that we're thinking over here. And in some ways, the second logic of inclusion within the OWG, so we talked about the state one, the non-state actor inclusion, again, the process does enable non-state actors to participate, unlike the GGE, as I said, which is 30 states that participated. It was just them. No opportunity to look at what they were discussing or even like webcast at the UN. And the OWG does all of those things, which is great. But the disabler, I'd say, or let's say the paradox of inclusion for non-state actors is obviously that and it has become a weaponized discussion. So since the start of this latest OEWG, the 2021 to 2025, what we've seen is right at the start, at least a year of the process, or more than half of the first year of the process, there was this stalemate between states that wanted to promote effective modalities for stakeholder participation so that they would be able to provide their speech, to give a speech over at the UN, or that they would be able to listen in through the UN webcast, or that they would be able to be accredited And there were other states that said, no, we don't need to have those stakeholders. But they also said, well, if we have to have these stakeholders, we need to have a veto power over who gets to be in the room. So that has led to a stalemate for most of the first bit, and after that, to effective vetoing of different organizations, including my organization, and also, let's say, really important technical community experts such as the Foreign on Incident Response Team, which could effectively provide input into some of the conversations, but that they were also vetoed by some member states. So you see that there is a process enabling, but that there are political challenges or things when it comes to the meaningful inclusion of non-state actors in these spaces. And just to finalize, because I'm sure that I'm almost on time, like done with my time, is looking at the third logic of inclusion. So we talked states, non-state actors, and I think the third one is thinking about the context where this dialogue is being held, being more inclusive. So this is a first committee process, which means that, usually it's the highest level of the conversation on international peace and security when it comes to cyber. So obviously the chair of this process has a lot of responsibility to shape meaningfully that inclusion. So the enabler there for thinking about this broader context of the dialogue is the chair, for example, hosting online convenings. He organized the high-level roundtable on cyber capacity building, where organizations from different parts of the world could effectively share their experiences in implementing cyber capacity building. You see also in this process different proposals from developing countries gaining traction, such as Kenya suggesting and tabling recommendation for a portal to look at, threats. So that other states that might not have as much cyber threat intelligence or that might have less access to information that they can share. So you also have coalitions of different states coming together, both, developing cross-regional representatives, which is not something specific about the OEWG, but it says that the process is enabling those types of interactions in spite of a geopolitical tension between two poles that you see effectively happening in the room. But you see, for example, El Salvador working with Estonia, working with Switzerland to think about the applicability of international law in cyberspace and tabling, let's say, documents for a further conversation. But the outcome, or let's say the background tension in this third bit of like the space of this dialogue is really that is the question of what comes next. So I don't know how many of you are familiar, but the OEWG is coming to an end in 2025 in July, and there is another proposal for a program of action. So let's say another way in which we structure the dialogue at the UN within this, a regular institutional dialogue for cyber. And there is this dichotomy between these two proposals. One is that obviously the OEWG was the result of a Russia table proposal, which has effectively been, successful in the past 5 years in actually pushing the conversation forward, at least maintaining that dialogue. But there's obviously a need for a more dynamic dialogue that can go deeper into different topics and that, can more effectively include stakeholders. And that's the program of action. Not that one is better than the other, but there are different proposals for how that dialogue should happen, that regular institutional dialogue. And the member states will need to decide. So within this context of these three paradoxes, in many ways, how do you think that going forward? And I think there is a very politicized tension between these two proposals. And I think right now is thinking about the design of the process, right? And I don't think that necessarily we're always tackling those underlying inequalities. But in any case, I just wanted to stop there. I think there are other bits in terms of the relationship between the IGF and the OWG, or the coexistence of different UN processes, especially on cyber. But I'm very happy to talk about that afterwards. But I just wanted to maybe set the scene from an OWG standpoint of what are these different logics of inclusion and what are the challenges to these three logics of inclusion.
Louise, thank you so much. That is a incredibly rich introduction and overview of the paradox of inclusion, and I really appreciate you breaking it down into sort of this question of between states with non-state actors, and also these other modalities of inclusion as well. Given that you covered so much ground there, I do just want to give the people in the room and online the chance to respond or ask a few questions while it's fresh in their mind. And then we will turn to our next panelist. So if there is anyone who would like to come in online, please do put your question in the chat. If you'd like to come in person, obviously just raise your hand, and we will bring the mic to you. So while you're maybe thinking of that, and if anyone is thinking of questions, I would just highlight one recent publication from Virtual Roots through our site Binding Hook. Now, Binding Hook is a way to disseminate academic research in an accessible way to a wide audience. And there's a new piece from last week on Pacific Island cybersecurity, how to co-design cybersecurity governance for and with Pacific Island states. So if you're interested in that part of Louise's remarks, please do check out that piece that has just come out on Binding Hook. If there are no questions in the chat and everyone here seems very content, I will move on to our next panelist, who is Yasmin Azuzi. And Yasmin, again, please do introduce yourself a little bit more, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Louise, for that incredible overview. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Yasmin. I am a cybersecurity program officer at the ITU. So the ITU, as many of you know, is the UN agency, a specialized agency for ICTs. And indeed, given my role, I will also be focusing a little bit more on the cybersecurity processes, as Louise has beautifully done. But indeed, I think it's a pivotal moment for internet governance. So next year, we have the WSIS Plus 20. We're currently navigating the Global Digital Compact, topic-specific ones like the ones in cybersecurity, open-ended working group, ad hoc committee on cybercrime. And we're seeing in general, as mentioned very nicely, that there is a proliferation of fora, which has obviously both opportunities and challenges. So I think at the heart of this paradox, the paradox of inclusion, is the number of fora that are also addressing overlapping issues, overlapping internet governance issues. And this being compounded, of course, by duplication and silos at times. So, for example, I can give a specific example from the ITU. So agreements that member states and resolutions that member states have voted on at ITU statutory meetings on the topic of cybersecurity capacity building at times are often sometimes also discussed at the open-ended working group agenda item on cybersecurity. And this is partly due to member state representation in the ITU being mainly ministries of ICTs, Ministry of Communication, of Digitalization, while at the open-ended working group, first committee diplomats at times, but also representatives of national cyber agencies. This shows basically a lack of coordination at national level. And of course, many developing states are facing capacity constraints that prevents them from being represented in this. Just about financial resources, at times it's also the technical expertise and ability to navigate the interdisciplinary nature of digital policymaking. So this, I think, is the core of why this paradox exists, because the silos that are present at national level are being reflected internationally. In fact, digital issues touch upon multiple disciplines, so it can span from national security to economic development to human rights to sociological change, and this very interdisciplinarity, while enriching, also contributes to the fragmentation. So I'll take cybersecurity as an example. As the open-ended working group addresses cybersecurity within the first committee of the General Assembly, which focuses on peace and security. Ad hoc committee on cybercrime operates in the third committee. Yet cybersecurity can also have implications in the second committee on economic development, it's a critical role in securing. And in parallel to that, at the same time, at the ITU, at WSIS processes as well, we are emphasizing technical cyber capacity building for the purpose of sustainable development and economic and social development. And this is far removed from peace and security aspects being discussed elsewhere. Particularly, the Global Digital the Global Digital Compact, naming cybersecurity more as enabler of a securing digital space in general, and it focuses very much on the harms, on privacy protection, and calls, let's say, for international cooperation more on a high-level way. So this way of compartmentalization makes it challenging for stakeholders, particularly from low-resource nations, to align their priorities and also to maintain continuity across these different, which causes, again, the silos and duplication. Paradoxically, given also the top, the solution actually may lie in reducing this fragmentation at national level by improving, for example, interagency coordination, focusing on fostering interdisciplinary teams that are equipped to engage meaningfully in multiple fora. And I think that this approach can offer some key advantages. So first off, countries need to establish multidisciplinary teams that can have expertise in technical, diplomatic, and also policy-making communities. For example, representation of national cybersecurity agencies or national computer incident response teams at the open-ended often results in practical, context-specific that are a bit different compared to, let's say, traditional career diplomats. However, this, of course, requires a pipeline of trained multidisciplinary professionals that have the expertise in technology, but also in diplomacy. So being able to operate in that nexus in a way. Second, capacity building with inclusivity in mind must be key. So initiatives must prioritize inclusive capacity building that can bridge technical and policy silos. So for example, at the ITU, exercises and drills that bring together those two communities at national level, so that they are accustomed, let's say, to interagency collaboration in that manner. Programs should focus on enabling countries to engage also in internet governance fora in a holistic manner. So being equipped both, again, from the technical and the policy perspective. And I think streamlining global processes can be, let's say, a very utopic goal, because it's realistic or useful to think of consolidating all internet governance fora. But what we can focus on is actually enhancing coordination and avoiding duplication by aligning mandates, creating, let's say, better linkages between discussions. For example, on the capacity building, cybersecurity capacity building these agendas can be harmonized across Open-Ended Working Group, ITU, and Global Digital Compact, for example, to reduce redundancy. Lastly, I think governments should incentivize interagency collaboration across technical, diplomatic, and policy community at national level, which can actually create these interdisciplinary teams. And this can also include having coordination mechanisms in place that can regularly consult across disciplines so that there is consistency when it comes to international negotiations and international fora. So just to conclude, as we're looking at let's say, the future of internet governance at the WSIS Plus 20 and other, important to focus on building bridges between disciplines, given the very interdisciplinary nature of the topic at hand. At bridges also between national and international levels, bridges between interagency bridges, let's say, at national level, of course, between well-resourced and under-resourced actors. Internet, we want to think one that really reflects diverse voices and can enable all nations, regardless of capacity, to reach a meaningful seat at the table, and so that we can overcome this paradox of inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasmin. And just to repeat my call from earlier, if anyone does have any questions for Yasmin or Louise at this stage, then please do bring them into the discussion. We would love to hear from you, whether you are in person or online. I am extremely pleased to have our third speaker here, Corinne Kasher from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Malta. Corinne, please do come up to the table. You snuck in behind me, and I didn't even see you, so that's clearly operating in stealth mode. Now, Corinne hopefully we'll follow on with her perspective on the paradox of inclusion and maybe also the paradox of travel in Riyadh as well. So Corinne, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'll hand over the mic to you.
Yes, hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I don't have much to add actually to what Yasmin already said, because I think she really encompassed the discussion very well, and I noticed that she really sort of hit the nail right on the head about the paradox of inclusion. So I just really wanted to add on to what Yasmin said. I think it's important to avoid having the fragmentation of all these processes through also the fact that you need both the technical and the political level to work very closely together. And the issue of resources was one that really struck me. I know this is one of the main issues, that there are a lack of resources, and from our perspective as Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are really working hard to fund resources so that we aim to actually provide resources where necessary. So if it's, for example, the fact of the lack of representation, we fund fellows, we fund also diplomats from, let's say, least developed countries, etc., so that they are able to be represented at the highest levels of decision making. One other aspect that struck me was the need to harmonize the processes and also to enhance coordination. I think this is really key. And obviously the Global Digital Compact only came into, let's say, adoption last September at the UN General Assembly, so we will see how it will fit in with the other processes. But that's all from my end. I will add some closing remarks as well. But I really wanted to hear what participants think about this and what their views are on how to promote more inclusion, and also to avoid the fragmentation of the processes, because this will be really sort of key in us as governments to factor in what needs to be done for this to be, let's say, a more harmonized process. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. And yes, we look forward to your concluding remarks as well. So before we turn to an open discussion, and at that point, I will be asking everyone what your perspective is on the paradox of inclusion. So please do get some interventions ready. What I'm going to do is reflect a little bit on one example of the paradox of inclusion that I've been working on very closely. And what I'll do is I'll use Louise's framework, because I think it's a very helpful one, of inclusion at a state level, inclusion at a non-state or multi-stakeholder level, and inclusion in terms of modalities as well, to illustrate how this paradox emerges through a particular process. And the one I'll talk about isn't the OEWG or the Global Digital Compact, these sort of very high-profile major ones. It's a little bit more niche. It's the Pall Mall process. Now, can I get a quick show of hands in the room if you've heard of or know about the Pall Mall process? If anyone does, then please put your hand up. Glad the panelists do as well. If you don't, then I think I will give a quick overview of what it is. So recently, there's been a recognition among many states that many offensive cyber tools, otherwise known as cyber intrusion capabilities, have both positive and negative uses. They have positive uses because they are necessary for cybersecurity. They help organizations test their defenses and improve their defenses through things like penetration testing within cybersecurity. So asking someone external to try and hack into your networks so you know where the holes are and you can fix them. They have negative uses when they are used by cyber criminals for ransomware or other theft, and also when they are misused by state actors, right? So this is where companies would offer cyber intrusion capabilities commercially, often known as spyware, and then states would buy that and then use it. This is in many cases, perfectly legitimate activity, right? States need such surveillance capabilities for reasons of national security, but often, in many cases, they have overstepped the line, right? They have used capabilities in ways that are not proportionate, that lead to significant human rights violations as well. This is a recognized issue in internet governance. And there have been many efforts to try and address this at both the national and a multi-stakeholder level. And so, for example, you have the US, which is a major producer of these capabilities, right? It's a major center for spyware development, research, and sale. The US then imposes sanctions on particular companies that it thinks have violated the norms or boundaries that it wants to impose. So there are very high-profile cases of US sanctions and indictments and other measures, such as restrictions on government procurement. So US government agencies can't buy from certain companies in order to shape this market. There are also efforts at the multi-stakeholder level. Some of you may have heard of the Cyber Tech Accord. And this is a group of tech companies, industry companies, who came together to develop their own voices on internet governance. They produced principles for what they called curbing the cyber mercenary market, right? So they put a different frame on it, but again, they're trying to intervene in this sphere. Now, again, that wasn't especially effective, and so what happened last year is a new initiative was launched called the Pall Mall process. This aimed at both bringing in industry, including the spyware industry itself, including the companies worried about that, such as the big tech companies, including the states buying and using spyware and commercial cyber intrusion capabilities, and those being affected by it. So, in short, it was a big tent initiative, right? It wanted to get everyone together to find a solution to this complex problem. And let's unpack that initiative, which has now been running for just under a year, in the 3 levels that Louise mentioned. Firstly, at a state level, was it inclusive? Well, in one way, yes, right? Anyone who wanted to, any state that wanted to sign up to the Pall Mall Declaration, published in February, could do so, right? They could attend the conference, they could engage in discussions, and put their name at the bottom, right? And now the state interaction on these discussions is getting more detailed. But it was still not completely equal, right? The sponsors of this initiative, the funders and organizers, are the British and French governments, right? They are the ones running it. They are aiming to include as many other states as possible, but ultimately the conferences are in Europe, they're in the UK and France. Most of the attendees are from, and organizers are from these states. And so there's a tension there between having a very stereotypical sort of European perspective on the issues and making it as wide an invitation as possible. So that's at the state level. At the multi-stakeholder level, yes, there are efforts to include multi-stakeholders. So Virtual Roots is a multi-stakeholder participant in the Pall Mall process. And multi-stakeholders have the voice, the opportunity to engage at these conferences. They can submit responses to a consultation that closed a couple of months ago on these issues, and they will continue to be able to feed into the process. But again, this is clearly a 2-tier system, right? You have in each event a day reserved for multi-stakeholder discussion, and then a day reserved for state-only discussion. So while the multi-stakeholders are able to input, they are not able to observe or have any understanding of what is going on in the state negotiations. So in a way, it's a bit like the OEWG on one side and then the GG on the other side, right? Where it's just the states in a closed forum. So multi-stakeholder, yes, but also two-tier. And then finally, in terms of modalities, and this is where it is very interesting. The open consultation that ran for 3 months over the summer this year was on the declaration on the way forward for the Pall Mall process. And what was interesting was a lot of industry coalitions and companies contributed to this consultation. Most of them were from the cybersecurity industry, right? They were contributing from the defensive side. But what the aim was for also to get the companies who build and make and sell the spyware to contribute as well, right? It's a genuinely multi-stakeholder process. And it didn't quite succeed in that, right? They were looking for more and more contributions from all parts of the industry as well as civil society as well. And so, again, when you go into each of these processes, and that's just one example, you can unpack the layers in which efforts at inclusion are both very laudable, right? They do, in fact, increase inclusion. But on the other hand, they only go so far. And indeed, the barrier to entry to these processes, the amount of knowledge you have to enter, is far beyond maybe that of an embassy diplomat or a non-specialist, right? You need to really be engaged in these processes to contribute effectively. So with that example, I will now open the floor. And so how we'd like to run this second half of the session is just to ask the participants in person or online. If you're online, then please do put it in the chat. I will read it out and we can ask the panelists to reflect on your remarks, to ask you some very simple questions. Firstly, does the paradox of inclusion ring true to you, right? Is it something that you recognize in your own work? Is it something that you think, nah, what are you talking about? Why are we even here, right? So that's question one. Question two is, where do you see it most relevant to your work, and how might you try and overcome it, right? So maybe first, is it something that you recognize, and then where and how do you see it happening? I'll pause. In the room, please do put your hand up if you'd like to contribute. Online, please do come in on the chat.
Yes. Okay, I can hear myself. That's good. Thank you so much. I'm Julia Ebel from the Austrian Foreign Ministry, currently working at the mission in Geneva, and I've been involved in some of the processes that you've talked about. So it was very enlightening to see kind of a full overview, because I can very much resonate with the questions that you've raised, that as a diplomat, we tend to work on a couple of these processes, but not all of them. So I was not aware of the Pall Mall Declaration, for example, because I've been on a mission abroad and not in capital, working on the processes holistically, for example. So that was very interesting. Thank you very much for bringing that up as a question. I wanted to make 3 points on everything that has been discussed. And one was, from my point of view, we need different expertise in all these processes. And what you've brought up, for example, cybercrime, cybersecurity, when we look at it from a national point of view, cybercrime, we had a lot of our criminal law experts involved nationally, looking at actual criminal law provisions and how it would be applied for us. When we talk about cybersecurity, we get a lot of the defense side in, we get international law questions in, so this requires quite a different expertise and different people, also from a national level. But I do hear the need for also coordinating better nationally, so that is something for sure, and we also always try to bring national experts also into our delegations when we have these discussions on different processes and negotiations. But Austria also funds other like developing country diplomats to come to certain processes. We did that, for example, in the cybercrime process, that we wanted to get the experts from capitals from developing countries to be part of the process, because we don't only want to talk among diplomats, we want to talk with the people that actually have to implement this at a national level. That is something we did, and I know the Council of Europe is also very active on capacity building when it comes to that. So there are initiatives, and there is a wish to bring in the people that actually work on these issues, at least when we talk about government participation. One thing that resonated with me is what Yasmin said about what the ITU does and then what the different committees in New York do. And having worked in both environments, I do see that there is a bit of a lack of communication between Geneva and New York on processes like that. And then, of course, you have the capitals in it as well. And that's a bit of my question also to the panelists of, have you seen any best practices, or do you have any ideas of how to help both from a member state's perspective, from a stakeholder perspective, and also from a UN agency perspective? Like, how can we strengthen the communication between these processes to avoid duplication, which is a strain for all of us, really?
Thank you so much for your intervention, and a combination of both very insightful points and also a good question to push us to sort of identify best practices as well. Yasmin, given we had a little bit on the ITU, maybe I could turn to you first, and then Louise online to give a little response. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very insightful question. Indeed, I think it's a decades-long problem of having the lack of communication between the Geneva and New York. But when it comes to good practices, one thing that pops into mind is the kind of work that we do at the ITU at national level in particular. So if I give you an example, when we are supporting developing countries in particular, when it comes to their development or establishment of something like national cybersecurity strategies, part of that agreed upon methodology is to actually have consultation workshops prior that are inclusive of many different stakeholders. And at times we found ourselves in contexts where those same actors had never actually been in the same room together. But this is sort of a prerequisite that we put in terms of, if you need your strategy to be developed, these are the people that you need to have in the room. And so that stems from, of course, an inclusion need, but also a very practical need. I mean, if a strategy, since it is a living document, it's something that needs to be implemented, is developed by a small group of stakeholders and then is asked actually to be implemented by wider stakeholders, it makes it difficult. So creation of ownership, I think, at national level across different expertises. So ministries, national agencies, but also critical infrastructure providers. We've had in the same room central banks, energy representatives, but also ministries ranging from MFA all the way to, of course, defense, interior, and others, because, of course, it's extremely interdisciplinary, and a national strategy also needs to have all of those elements be taken into consideration. So this is, let's say, a model that we have seen being also the start also of better coordination at interagency level, where you didn't have it before. We've often felt a bit of resistance at times from, let's say, the lead agency at national level, due to, I guess, wanting to keep ownership over things. But then gradually seeing that shared ownership has actually yielded better results in terms of coordination, but also in terms of effective implementation of things, and having also different perspectives on the same topic has actually, taught a lot to different stakeholders. So I think this could be one good practice. So having, again, might seem like a leitmotif here, but multi-stakeholder actors at the table prior to, let's say, major negotiations or major establishment of strategies or policies is part of the solution. It might sound obvious or simple or easy, but I think this is really where it starts. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. And Louise, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And I mean, I 100% agree with what Yasmin just said. But just to add on top of that, I'd say there are 2 points that came to mind when you were kind of asking your question. And one of them is, I wonder whether we need to create a community that goes to these places and that kind of like, I know that that is like spreading one thin, and I think that's exactly where we started this conversation of, do we have to follow so many processes that we can't actually do that? So I mean, from both a government and a non-governmental perspective, I think, for example, attending the OWG and attending the IGF, that community being able to leave that privileged space, and also, I mean, you could argue that there's some privileges to being able to actually attend the IGF, but being able to have those communities going to other places means that whenever there's not an overlap, there's a new set of a community there, but you ensure that there is that knowledge transfer, or at least that experience from that particular room, it's going to that other place. So I think the question here is, how do we take these New York dynamics or New York centric dialogues, and how do we translate it, transpose it, and let's say provide the space for those same dialogues, even though, let's say, not in the same format, to happen in other places. And I think there's some answers, or let's say best practices, that I'd like to highlight. The first one is, well, just a couple of days ago, and starting from that same productive discomfort, RUSI and Virtual Routes, we organize the cyber policy dialogues over here at the IGF, well, over there at the IGF, which is a networking session, right? And the purpose is really to identify people that are doing that kind of similar research, or that are engaging in those spaces, or that are interested in those spaces, right? So creating the space for us to have those kinds of New York-centric conversations, like in another geographic location, is absolutely fundamental. And that is one way in which we can do that from, let's say, a IGF, OAWG kind of cross-pollination, but that could obviously apply for many, many other, let's say, processes. Another possibility there, or example, is that over at RUSI, we have launched the Global Partnership for Responsible Cyber Behavior, which is a platform for researchers from all different regions to kind of come together and reflect of what responsible cyber behavior means from their, let's say, perspective, from their geographic location. And we organized a discussion over in Singapore during the Singapore Cyber Week with researchers and government representatives, not just from the Southeast Asian countries, but other regions as well, that were attending CICW to discuss norms of responsible state behavior and the practical behaviors that they see from their regional perspective. So we got like small island countries saying that, for example, climate-related concerns and critical infrastructure protection is much more relevant, or that is actually kind of like state responsibility, and responsible state behavior is ensuring that the climate discussion is connected to the critical infrastructure discussion at the first committee, right? Which is a very different interpretation, you would argue, but that it is like, once you go to the regional level and once you do that cross-pollination, is that can be quite useful. So I mean, that is another example of a best practice of how we take those very specific bubbles and how do we, let's say, expand those dialogues, and how we as non-governmental actors can do that. But also as governments, I think one other example that I would give here is my other, let's say, side is, I'm part of the National Cybersecurity Committee in Brazil, which has been established as an outcome of the National Cybersecurity Policy. And that committee is mostly government representatives, like different parts of the government, of the public administration, but you do have 3 civil society representatives and 3 industry representatives and 3 representatives from the technical community. And what we've been discussing, one of the things, is how to make sure that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can better coordinate across, do more of the interagency coordination to then take those, let's say, inputs to the international fora, right? So is it necessary for some countries you don't need to have a formal mechanism, and for Brazil it hasn't been a formal mechanism, but just having the conversation about how to do that better and how to kind of like calibrate, because the ministry has developed its own cyber division, right? How to foster that or facilitate that liaison role that the MFA crucially plays in collating those different views, right? Even if you can't have a more diverse delegation going with you to, let's say, New York or Geneva. So my question, perhaps back to the diplomats in the room, is, is there something about best practices of the MFA being more well equipped or best practices there to think about how to facilitate that interagency coordination, or even if you have a shortage of resources, how you can feed back into those places or feed into in a better setting? Do we need to have MFAs more well equipped for this scenario where there's really a spread of different cyber related processes? Anyways, I'll stop there because, as you've seen, I speak way too much, but hopefully I'd like to hear from you all.
Thank you very much, Louise. And just to add a short footnote to what Louise and Yasmin have said, I think Louise started by saying there are two reasons, right, for this proliferation of initiatives. One is specialization, and the other one is politicization, right? And Yasmin pointed out that one of the main challenges is giving participants, whether multi-stakeholder or states, a sense of ownership in each initiative, right? So you want to engage early, engage transparently, and set out a clear roadmap for how things will go ahead and when people should and how they should intervene. Now, the danger there, right, is that if you engage very transparently and openly early on with people who do not share the same objectives of the initiative, maybe even would like to sabotage or delay it or see it not exist, right? Then that gives them an opportunity to do so very easily, because you say, okay, we will not move ahead until we have got full ownership from everyone in the room. And so someone says, oh, I want this to happen, I'm not going to agree, and it doesn't move ahead. So the best practice that I think of here is be as open as possible, right? So do engage really transparently early on, but with clear, deadlines and with clear suggestions for who will take forward action after those deadlines, right? So you have things like the Power Mile consultation period, right? That is good because it invites broad interventions, it has a deadline, and it's clear who will go on afterwards. So it's very hard to say, no, there was no opportunity to be involved from want to see it go ahead or want to push forward for a delaying tactic. But still, the real nub of the issue is that how do you identify those actors that will take it forward? Is it going to be the same people, right? So ideally not. So in the Palma process, in the absence of anyone else, right, they close the consultation, and it's the UK and France who then take it forward. So you're back to the original problem of inclusion. Ideally, you would have a different set of actors, but who will be nominated and ready and funded with the resources to take it forward. So just to highlight that the politicization happens in those processes as well. We do have a question online. So I wonder if we could enable unmuting, and Akriti, please do ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. I guess it's more of a comment to Luis's point than a question. And I'd love to be able to unmute video if that's possible, by the way. It can't, but I think just to the point about politicization and what Luis was saying about the MFA. So I'm Akriti, I work at Global Partners Digital, and before that I was working in India's foreign ministry in the G20. And something that we noticed, and especially more so when we were organizing a convention on cybercrime and AI and NFT, and this was part of the G20 presidency, so it was under the aegis of technically the foreign ministry, but because there's so many departments. Like for us, the internal security is done by a ministry called the Ministry of Home Affairs, and then we have a Ministry of Information and Technology, and then we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, and I was coordinating technically on the side of the MFA, but coming from tech policy, I was kind of more aware than say most foreign policy people were about some of those discussions. And I think what I noticed was that a lot of the times the positions that came up were something that at least my MFA were just checking to make sure that it didn't go against sorry, what we had said at the UN. It wasn't so much that they were making the policy as so much that they were just checking that it wasn't contradicting our international opinion on something else. So I just wonder that even if we did have diplomatic practices from the MFA, I think a lot of constructive input, and that's our challenge as civil society, is kind of to make sure that we have connections or sort of a community or interactions with different like the internal political machinery, which is different ministries, because a lot of times you can come in at the very last stage, but we're not really involved in the point where the policy is being discussed so much as just where it's being vetted. And to me, sort of that's a very clear delineation between how you participate. So there's of course the things that the MFA can do, but I just wonder how much of that onus on how to involve civil society will then fall on, say, the MFA, whereas permeating that culture within the internal politics where you invite opinion from civil society and different departments. And I guess there is going to be one ministry that needs to lead that. And if it's an internet governance, which I guess a lot of times happens in international discussions, and whether that's an MFA prerogative or whether it's someone else. But I think that's a huge challenge for us as civil society from a national point of view, that how is our national engagement so strong that when we say something internationally, it really comes from kind of the local perspective, or that we're heard at the very first layer that we can be heard at. Thank you.
Kriti, thank you so much. And yeah, it again just highlights this important for coordination at both layers, right? You cannot have a inclusive and effective international layer without first working hard and solving problems at the national layer. We do have a representative from a Ministry of Foreign Affairs on our panel. So I was wondering, Corinne, if you would maybe say a little bit about your perspective on what the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in these issues. Of how technical should it be? How can it rely on other technical communities and draw on those different parts of government?
First of all, I wanted to make a point on the Pall Mall process. We received an invitation from the French and the UK governments to participate, to receive a formal invitation. And I have to say that we thought about it, and we thought that it was a very important process. Particularly on the point of also promoting inclusivity, and on also getting industry and other different factions on board. So we did participate. This was the first time for us, and I was aware also of the different factions that participated. We had one representative from the industry, and one representative from the line ministry that participated, and I was happy to see that they were included in the consultation process. And I think for us this was something that we would like to also encourage other states to sign up to, because it's very important to, not only in terms of, as I said, including the other let's say factions that are not always included in the decision making, but also as a way of promoting let's say coordination between different states. So that was a point on the Pall Mall process. And on the points raised, I very much share the same thoughts as the Austrian colleague as well, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There are a lot of different processes, and with the different processes you have to see which representatives are going to attend which process. Sometimes it's very difficult also from our side. I think particularly difficult was the Cybercrime Convention. Because we had an issue of not having our delegates participate directly in New York. Our criminal lawyers, it was very difficult to get them them to participate in negotiating sessions. So it was very challenging for us because we had to rely on our delegates in New York and to coordinate back sort of with the line ministry. So that was very challenging because as also one other thing is with the sort of proliferation of different processes, I mean, even the line ministries themselves are having to keep up or having to keep up pace with all these different processes taking place. And sometimes, you don't have the necessary specialists. Especially with cybercrime, for example, there are certain technicalities where we don't have the necessary expertise to deal with them. So it's very hard to keep pace with all these different processes to make sure that you have all these specialists on board, and I would say that the Cybercrime Convention for us was the most difficult because of the fact that we didn't have these specialists who would be able to go back and forth from New York to Malta and negotiate. And I was also very struck by what Louise said about the sort of transfer of knowledge from New York to other centers of discussion. I mean, the fact that I'm participating the first time in the IGF is also sort of decision based on that. The fact that I'm coming from the Foreign Ministry, but at the same time I'm participating in a forum where it's not just the Foreign Ministry, but also other technical fellows, civil society, etc. are participating. I think it's important to share knowledge in that respect. And there was another point on, I believe that Louise raised about the sort of need to have this sort of harmonization process going also with respect to the Cyber Security Committee, which she mentioned about Brazil. We also have a Cyber Security Committee in Malta. I'm a representative on that committee, and again it brings together all the players, all the line ministries, all the representatives of the industry, but the Foreign Ministry is really sort of coordinating, let's say, has a coordinating role in that, make sure that what the representatives or the delegates say, as also the online participant mentioned, doesn't sort of run counter to what we say in New York or in other areas. But I think the fact that this cybersecurity committee was established was very not only timely but also very important. I think it has helped a lot to first of all bring sort of to the table items or let's say issues that maybe not all participants or delegates are aware of. I'm thinking in particular about the issue of the application of international law in cyberspace. For example, that was an area which was being discussed at the EU level, but not every delegate, let's say from the police force to let's say the critical infrastructure department, I mean, they were not aware of the discussions that were taking place. I mean, they were aware of it in a general sense, but not so much into the detail. And I think it was very important that this was raised at the committee. And so, I mean, the committee has a very important role to play because it brings together the different sort of factions, but it also enables certain issues to be exchanged, to have more information. And for us, it was important. I think without the committee, certain sort of items or issues would maybe fall through the cracks, and then line ministries or other entities would come to know about it much later than they would actually come to know about it if there was not the committee. So I think it's a very important framework as well. For us, it's sort of a formal establishment. It's under the Office of the Prime Minister, so there's a sort of also prime ministerial lead over that, which gives it also a certain influence and a certain weight to take decisions. But I believe that this is also one aspect where harmonization comes into play, and where we avoid also the fragmentation of cyber issues, because at the end of the day, there's so many processes, so many different ministries tackling different aspects of cyber. The sort of committee brings them together, and for us nationally, it's helped a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina, and that's a fantastic insight into how these national structures of coordination work as well. Akriti, I can see you've got your hand up to respond again, and then I will open the floor. So Akriti, come in, and then we'll open the floor.
Yeah, thanks. Just to point out, because she mentioned the issue of cybercrime convention, and from our point of view, so when India, we had this law in India which was struck down by the Supreme Court, which was our highest law on the land, because the speech was extremely vague in terms of what it marked as offensive, and the overreach was such that it was marked down. And then eventually India tried to bring the exact, like literal verbatim exact same prohibition to the cybercrime convention, trying to circumvent our national jurisdiction to then have it, obviously with international law, and then you have to ratify it, then to get it back into our national legislation. And it was I mean, it was honestly a little bit shocking to us as civil society that that route was trying to be used to legitimize the chilling effect on freedom of speech again. But also another point was that because that was happening at the cybercrime convention, and at least in India, the capacity to follow international conversations on internet governance and such is much more limited than national. So the kind of traction that we got on that was so little. Like if you weren't very specifically tracking the cybercrime convention, which is kind of literally maybe one organization, if any, in India, then it didn't get as much traction as when, of course, the national debate was happening. And I think that was quite, for us, just kind of alarming to see that they were moving to the international fora from the national fora, and kind of because the harmonization works that the way it does, they thought that they could try to get away with it, and eventually it didn't pass, of course. So it's not a reality today, but it was quite alarming to see that those kind of actions also happen. And the lesser we see harmonization and even just civil society kind of input or attention on the internet governance spaces, it can really come back from what people consider an elitist internet governance level to really our national legislation. So just to respond to that, thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, that example of states trying to circumvent maybe civil society or popular resistance to certain measures of legislation by going through the international level is really fascinating. Is there anyone else in the room who would like to come in with their perspective on the paradox of inclusion? I see no hands. Would anyone online like to come in? Please do raise your hand or put something in the chat. If not, then I will offer the floor to Yasmin and Louise for their interventions. But there is someone already, so Sasha, please do come in. And can we give Sasha some video as well, if you'd like to have video. If you don't want, then leave it off.
Yep. Hi, good day. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you, yes. Welcome.
Yes. All right. I can't get the video, so that's fine. All right, so my name is Sasha Nanel. I'm here from the University of Prince Edward Islands, and my perspective is through the digital inclusion perspective. And just inquiry concerning the way in which we look at the way in which we fragment internet, generally speaking, and the way in which we identify the subtext within the presentation of information. And when it comes to internet governance, how do we consider the identities that are being put forward? Is it going to be a situation where when you look at that lateral transfer from physical inclusion to digital inclusion, what structures are in place to ensure that minority identities are being presented in such a fashion that it is represented on the world stage? And just general comments on that particular space, because when it comes to our intersectionality in internet identity, it's important that we don't lose sight of those minority identities within that digital space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. In which case, what I will do, if there's no other comments in person, then I will offer the floor to Yasmin and Louise to give some concluding remarks, but also specifically to address that question of ensuring we have the digital inclusion of minoritized identities and communities. Louise, would you like to go first?
Sure, happy to do so, and thank you for that question, Sasha. I think from where I'm standing and from the, let's say, sorry if my voice is a bit robotic at the moment, but just recovering from a cold. From where I'm sitting and from the example that I gave, I think there is a reflection to be made as to how we best include or recognize minorities in the context of these very high level processes, right? And I think I gave a very brief example of how some member states have been trying to do that. And I know that that doesn't respond very specifically to like the kind of like physical, like offline, online kind of representation. But again, from that process specifically, let's say like the OAWG, you do have member states facilitating and supporting the Women in Cyber Fellowship, which I think creates, let's say, a precedent for not only having more like gender balance there, but effectively having women and folks from different, let's say, standpoints to actually negotiate an official text. And I wouldn't underestimate that because there are different ways of approaching the negotiation of a text, and obviously the subjectiveness of your background, where you're coming from, be it geographically, be it in terms of your gender, that really kind of like plays into the way in which you navigate the world. And that's not different when you enter a UN windowless room, right? And I think that's actually very important. And just seeing that specific fellowship taking place throughout the last, like, I don't know, since 2018 at least, 2019, sorry, with the start of the OAWG, you do see the consistency of, similar women attending these spaces. And I think that's good because it just maintains a memory of, having effective representatives there. So hopefully that responds a bit to your question, but again, from the very specific standpoint. My concluding remarks is almost like a summary because, as you know, James, I tried to kind of like cluster things and structure kind of thoughts. So going back to the notion of paradox, I think we have three paradoxes, if that's the word, now reflecting. I think the first one is thinking about the paradox of meaningful leadership. We talked about lots of different processes. I think there's a thing over here, which is there is a value in spearheading certain initiatives and setting into motion, so structuring it. But I think there's a very important point, and I think that's something that you raised quite nicely, James, which is there a moment for us to delegate some of that leadership? And if that leadership is delegated, how that should happen? Also calibrating political risks, right? Because that's what member states are usually doing, right? It's like, I don't want to lose control over this process, but I want to indicate that it's actually inclusive. But is there something about calibrating between spearheading, setting it in motion, and delegating? What does delegation look like? The Counter Ransomware Initiative has different working groups with different countries doing that, and I think non-state actors like chairing that, but I might be wrong. The second paradox then, meaningful leadership. The second one for me is like meaningful coordination. And in the meaningful coordination, I think what we saw is calibrating between like interagency mechanisms, developing those if that is something that's relevant at the national level, be it like a committee structure. So similarly to Malta, like in Brazil, it's right below like the office of the president. So that provides some political capital domestically. But how do you ensure also that you are having a mixed delegation once you go externally, right? So how do you calibrate between like interagency coordination and kind of like international projection? And the third paradox, and finally, is a meaningful dialogue. So and this is a provocation really, like, okay, it's very nice and easy to say like, oh, we're open to dialogue, to meaningful dialogue. We're going to bring these stakeholders in. We're going to do consultations. We'll have a very nice timeline and this will look very structured. But are we actually open to productive disagreement? Even if like for member states that are funding, like, there were lots of examples of like funding to go to the ad hoc committee, funding like least developed countries or developing countries or underrepresented communities. Is that actually in the end kind of like, is there an openness for a productively uncomfortable dialogue? That's the word. And open to other expert input from maybe communities that we don't know or that we haven't figured out. And I think one example is the Global Conference on Cyber Capacity Building, which obviously there's this whole kind of like cyber capacity building community within the cyber world, but there's a development community. So how do you bridge those? Not saying that the GC3B, the Global Conference on Cyber Capacity Building, is the example, but that is one case where you see this attempt to articulate that conversation and it's still very it's still gaining its own kind of like traction, right? And I'm sure Yasmin will have some additional thoughts on that. So these are the three kind of like points that I like to add there. But thank you very much all for your contributions. This was great, especially at 6 a.m. until like 8 a.m. here in London.
Thank you, Louise, and impressively awake. I was really struck by this idea of calibrating political risk and maintaining control, right? Because at the end of the day, right, to have a more inclusive process, to really spread ownership, there has to be some kind of letting go, right? Some states who are currently in charge or others who are in charge of the process have to relinquish some kind of control and be ready for the process to go in different directions. And that is really an uncomfortable place to be in, especially if your whole mandate as a Minister of Foreign Affairs or other official is to steer and maintain control in that way. Yasmin, minoritized identities and communities, and then concluding remarks. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, James. So I would like definitely to echo what has been said until now and really keep the focus also on fostering ownership at national level. I think the point on the delegation of leadership definitely is a challenging one, but I've seen through national processes, lead agencies that sort of relinquish a little bit that lead role to a certain extent and seeing the usefulness in doing that. That, of course, doesn't stop us from keeping the balance, of course. And I think both sort of approaches are necessary. So one of them is definitely creating the focus on interdisciplinary teams that are equipped, again, to engage meaningfully in different fora. So in a perfect world, we would have similar something to like what the Austrian representative here has mentioned, multidisciplinary teams that bring different experts at the international level as well. And I think to ensure also sort of continuity with these sort of multidisciplinary teams, keeping the lead agency as being sort of the core is also necessary. So the lead agency can sort of keep tabs on the processes, on the different ones, and give that overview as well on the different things that may be lacking at times, while in parallel to that, delegating some of that power or some of that leadership when it comes to having specific processes that are topic specific, for examples. So apart from the national level that I keep coming back to, that I think is really core, it's really the key here. Of course, inclusivity at international level is needed as well. Akriti's very relevant example definitely showed the need for obviously going beyond, let's say, multilateral or state-focused processes and keep that inclusivity also of civil society at the international level as well. But I think a lot of it actually needs to happen at national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. And finally, I would turn to our third panelist, Corinne Kasher, for your concluding remarks. We have had our 5-minute warning, so we will be wrapping up after these remarks. And thank you, everyone, for your participation. Corinne, over to you.
Thanks, James. Well, not much to say. I think the two panelists before me actually wrapped up everything nicely. I mean, we've discussed a lot today, and I think we'll take home. I'll definitely take home a few of the the remarks that participants made today, especially, yes, about the Austrian colleague mentioned interdisciplinary teams. And also Louise mentioned, for example, the transfer knowledge. Yasmin mentioned also the need to sort of about the consultation process. That was one thing that struck me most about best practices. So I think we have quite a checklist of things that we have gathered here today, and I think they were all very, very valid remarks. I myself, I think, I'm also pleased to be here, not only because I shared some of my experiences, but because I took home a lot of points to consider. So maybe, I don't know, I mean, we can definitely come up also with a sort of report from this session, and maybe circulate it to participants as well. But I think we have all spoken very much about the need to reduce fragmentation, about the need for inclusivity, about the need, as you said, of political risk and sort of relinquishing control. I personally think that what we discussed here today would be very relevant to take forward. Perhaps we can have another session also to follow up on this. And from my perspective, I mean, it ends there. I think we've discussed a lot today, and I'm very happy to have participated and to have listened to everybody's to everybody's take here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Corinne. And as a quick reminder before we close, please do check out RUSI's Global Partnership on Responsible Cyber Behavior, which is online. Louise is running that. And of course, do visit Virtual Roots, and we will be doing more activities in this space. We will be engaging more, so we'd love to continue to have this conversation in future. Have a great last day of the IGF, and thank you, everyone.